Now, in March of 2025, a long-form interview about Freemasonry began circulating far beyond the audiences that normally spend time thinking about lodges, ritual, or Masonic history. The guest was William Schnoebelen. The title presented him in the strongest possible way. A former 33rd degree Mason revealing what the fraternity supposedly keeps hidden. Millions of people watched, and for anyone unfamiliar with Freemasonry, the number alone did most of the work. 33rd degree sounds like the final floor of a building. It suggests that the speaker has climbed past the ordinary members, past the public explanations, and reached the room where the real answers are kept. But there is a small problem with that introduction. On Schnoebelen's own ministry website, material written under his name still describes him as a former 32nd degree Mason. His best-known book about Masonry has also long been marketed around the claim that he reached the 32nd degree. A current pamphlet on his own site places the description directly beneath his name, former 32nd degree Mason. That does not automatically prove that he never received some form of 33rd degree recognition later. It does not prove that everything he says about his experience is false, but it creates a very specific question. If the authority of the modern interview depends so heavily on the phrase former 33rd degree Mason, why does his own published material repeatedly stop 1 degree earlier? That question is more interesting than it first appears because it forces us to separate 3 things that conspiracy culture often blends together: what Freemasonry actually is, what a 33rd degree actually means, and what an individual witness can legitimately claim to know because of it. Once those 3 things are separated, much of the mythology becomes easier to understand. But one part becomes harder. The first surprise is that the familiar image of 33 Masonic levels stacked one above another is already misleading. In the basic lodge system, often called craft or Blue Lodge Masonry, there are 3 degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and Master Mason. The 3rd degree, Master Mason, is the foundational completion of that system. The Scottish Rite is an additional Masonic body that a Master Mason may choose to join. It numbers its degrees from the 4th through the 32nd, and also confers a 33rd degree under particular circumstances. In the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, in the United States, the organization itself says there is no Masonic degree more important than Master Mason. The 33rd is not a universal command rank over every Mason beneath it. That detail matters because the number has acquired a meaning outside Freemasonry that it does not necessarily possess inside it. Online, 33rd degree Mason is often used almost as shorthand for someone who has reached the hidden center of the entire fraternity. Inside the Scottish Rite, the structure is different. The 32nd degree is called Master of the Royal Secret. The 33rd can be conferred as an honor on members selected for service to the Rite or to society, while active members of a Supreme Council can also hold 33rd degree status in an administrative capacity. Different jurisdictions have their own rules and terminology, but the central point remains. 33 is not simply level 33 in a video game where every previous Mason lacks the final piece of information, and that immediately changes how we should hear any interview built around the number. A genuine 33rd degree Mason may have decades of experience. He may have witnessed ceremonies most non-Masons never see. He may have occupied important positions. But the title alone does not mean he speaks for every lodge, every jurisdiction, every rite, or every Mason in the world. Freemasonry has never been one perfectly centralized institution with a single headquarters controlling every branch. It is a family of organizations, grand lodges, appendant bodies, jurisdictions, traditions, and recognition relationships that developed across countries and centuries. That complexity is not a convenient skeptical escape hatch. It is one of the central facts of Masonic history. It is also one reason the fraternity produces so many contradictory descriptions. Ask one Mason what Masonry is, and he may describe a moral fraternity built around symbolism, charity, self-improvement, and fellowship. Ask another, and he may emphasize philosophy. A historian may focus on 18th century associational culture. A religious critic may interpret the rituals as a competing spiritual system. An esoteric writer may treat the same symbols as remnants of ancient mysteries. All of them can be looking at overlapping material while assigning radically different meanings to it. The popular mystery begins when those interpretations are arranged vertically. The ordinary Mason, the theory says, knows almost nothing. The higher Mason knows more. The 33rd degree Mason finally learns what the organization is really about. It is a compelling structure because it makes disagreement self-sealing. If a third-degree Mason denies a sensational claim, his denial can be dismissed because he has not advanced far enough. If a 32nd-degree Mason denies it, perhaps only the 33rd knows. And if a 33rd-degree Mason denies it, believers can always imagine another inner circle beyond him. Every denial becomes evidence of another layer. That is not an investigation. It is a system in which the claim can never lose. A better investigation begins with what can actually be checked. Modern Freemasonry does preserve secrets in the ordinary sense of the word. Recognition methods, portions of ritual, signs, grips, passwords, ceremonial language, and the experience of initiation have historically been treated as private. Early Masonic culture made secrecy part of membership. Historians studying 17th and 18th century sources have documented oaths, methods of recognition, and the social importance of belonging to a group whose members possessed knowledge outsiders did not. Secrecy was not invented by conspiracy theorists. It was part of the institution's architecture. But secrecy changes when a movement survives for centuries. In a world of printing presses, defectors, exposés, libraries, court records, digitization, and the Internet, Masonic ritual books have circulated publicly for generations. Anti-Masonic writers published alleged rituals almost as soon as organized Freemasonry became culturally prominent. Scholars can compare versions. Grand lodges publish histories and educational material. Scottish Rite bodies publicly describe their degree system, administrative structure, honors, museums, archives, and many of the symbols used in their work. This does not mean every private ceremony has become public in every jurisdiction. It means the mystery cannot be sustained simply by saying that outsiders have no material to examine. The evidence exists in layers too. This is where Schnoebelen becomes an unusually useful case study. He is not simply a random internet commentator repeating rumors. He has written about his claimed experiences for decades. His work predates social media. His biography, as presented through his ministry, includes involvement not only with Freemasonry, but with a long list of religious and occult traditions. He has become influential in some Christian circles precisely because he presents his story as testimony from someone who entered systems he later rejected. That genre has its own logic. Testimony is personal. It asks the listener to evaluate a person's account of what he saw, believed, practiced, and eventually came to reject. Some elements can be corroborated by documents. Others depend heavily on memory and trust. The more extraordinary the allegation becomes, the more important that distinction becomes. In the 2025 interview, Schnoebelen explains the familiar structure of the first three Masonic degrees and then the Scottish Rite progression. On that basic architecture, much of what he says can be checked against Masonic sources. There are 3 craft degrees. The Scottish Rite continues with additional numbered degrees. The 32nd is associated with the title Master of the Royal Secret. A 33rd degree exists. There are other initiatory systems outside the Scottish Rite with different numbering schemes and claims of lineage. None of this requires accepting a hidden conspiracy. Then the interview moves from structure into interpretation. Schnoebelen presents some high-degree material as evidence of a much darker spiritual reality behind Freemasonry. He discusses occultism, hidden teachings, and ideas that mainstream Masonic organizations explicitly reject as descriptions of their institution. At moments, the claims become so extreme that the question is no longer whether Freemasonry contains esoteric symbolism. It clearly does, depending on what we mean by esoteric. The question becomes whether the specific conclusions being attached to that symbolism are supported by independent evidence. This is where the distinction between an insider and an interpreter becomes essential. A person can genuinely participate in a ritual and still interpret its meaning differently from other participants. Religious history is full of that problem. 2 people can stand in the same ceremony and leave with opposing explanations of what occurred. One sees metaphor, another sees theology, another sees theater, another sees occult practice. Personal participation gives someone evidence about what he experienced. It does not automatically give him exclusive authority over what the experience ultimately means for everyone else. The same problem appears when famous Masonic authors are quoted as if they were official spokesmen for one universal secret doctrine. Albert Pike is perhaps the most common example. Pike was an enormously important 19th century figure in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and his writing is dense with comparative religion, mythology, philosophy, symbolism, and ideas that sound strange to modern readers. Because of that, isolated lines from Pike have circulated for more than a century as proof of almost every theory imaginable about Masonry. Manly P. Hall creates an even more instructive problem. Hall wrote The Lost Keys of Freemasonry in the 1920s using highly mystical language. One passage referring to the seething energies of Lucifer has been copied endlessly as supposed evidence that high-ranking Masons secretly worship Lucifer. The line is real. The context is more complicated. Hall was discussing the mastery and constructive use of powerful human energies in an explicitly mystical framework. More importantly, Hall later acknowledged that when he wrote the book, his direct contact with Freemasonry consisted of publicly available books. He did not become a Mason until decades later. That does not make Hall irrelevant to the history of Masonic esotericism. He eventually joined the fraternity and later received high Masonic honors. but chronology matters. A book written by a young esoteric philosopher before he joined Masonry cannot simply be transformed into a leaked instruction manual from the top of the organization. The text is evidence of what Hall believed about the deeper meaning of Masonry at the time. It is not automatically evidence of a secret institutional doctrine handed to him by a 33rd-Degree council. This is one of the recurring mechanisms behind Masonic conspiracy literature. A genuine quotation is found. The author really existed. The author may even have been a Mason at some point in his life. The quotation sounds extraordinary. Then the timeline disappears. The jurisdiction disappears. The difference between personal philosophy and official ritual disappears. What remains is a sentence floating in space, carrying far more authority than the historical context allows. But a serious documentary should not move too far in the opposite direction either. It would be equally lazy to say that because some quotations are misused, there is nothing unusual about Masonic ritual or secrecy. There is. Freemasonry deliberately uses initiation, symbolic death and rebirth, architectural metaphors, moral allegory, sacred texts, passwords, private ceremonies, dramatic narratives, and layered advancement. Its symbols were designed to be contemplated rather than reduced to a single public definition. That makes the fraternity unusually resistant to simple explanation, and the organization itself helped create that condition. Consider the history of the Scottish Rite. The first Supreme Council of the 33rd Degree was established in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1801. The Rite's traditional constitutional history invokes documents associated with 1786 and with Frederick the Great of Prussia, but modern Masonic historians themselves distinguish between tradition and what can be demonstrated from surviving documents. That distinction is revealing. Even inside Freemasonry, some origin stories have been subjected to the same historical pressure applied to any old institution. Which documents are contemporary, which appear later? Which claims were inherited because they gave a right, antiquity, and legitimacy? This does not expose a sinister secret. It exposes something more ordinary and more useful. Secretive institutions can develop legends about themselves, too. By the 19th century, Freemasonry had become culturally powerful enough that both admirers and enemies could treat it as a hidden engine of history. Masons were present in politics, business, the military, science, civic life, and religion. In some countries, lodges were associated with liberal or anti-clerical movements. In others, they were deeply tied to establishment figures. Some governments suppressed them. Some churches condemned them. Some political movements used Masonic networks. The same global label could therefore describe organizations functioning very differently from one country to another. This is where the popular idea of the Masons begins to fail. It imagines a singular actor where history shows a network of related institutions, but the failure of that image does not erase the role of networks. Membership can create trust. Private associations can create social capital. People who meet regularly behind closed doors can form relationships that matter outside the room. Historians do not need a supernatural doctrine to recognize that. Clubs, fraternities, universities, military units, churches, political parties, and professional associations all produce networks. The question is whether a particular historical outcome can be traced to such a network with evidence. The stronger the claim, the stronger that chain needs to be. This returns us to the 33rd degree. If a person claims to have been a mayor of a city, there are records. If he claims to have been a military officer, there are usually records. If he claims a university degree, there is an institution that issued it. Masonic membership is more private, and historical records can be incomplete, but the 33rd degree in a regular Scottish Rite jurisdiction is not supposed to be an invisible metaphysical transformation that leaves no organizational trace. It is conferred by a supreme council. It belongs to a jurisdiction. It has a date, a body, and a context. That is why the Schnoebelen discrepancy is so difficult to ignore. His own published material repeatedly identifies him as a former 32nd degree Mason. That is not an accusation from a hostile Masonic website. It appears in material distributed by the ministry, built around his work. The 2025 interview, by contrast, repeatedly frames him as a former 33rd degree Mason. The difference could have an innocent explanation. Perhaps he later received a 33rd degree from another body. Perhaps he received an honorary title from a system not recognized by the mainstream Scottish Rite. Perhaps the podcast used language supplied in a biography that compresses multiple initiatory systems. Perhaps an editor simply chose the more dramatic number. But each explanation creates the same next question: which body conferred it? That question becomes especially important because Schnoebelen's own story includes participation in rites with much larger degree numbers. In the interview, he describes involvement with forms of Memphis Misraim Masonry, systems that historically developed elaborate sequences of degrees extending far beyond 33. To an audience unfamiliar with Masonic history, a claim of reaching a 96th or 97th degree sounds like evidence that the 33rd was never really the top at all. In reality, these numbers belong to different rites and organizational genealogies. They cannot simply be stacked on top of the Scottish Rite as though one universal ladder continues upward. This is a recurring source of confusion in discussions of initiatory societies. Numbers look objective. They seem to create a measurable hierarchy, but a 95th degree in one rite is not automatically 62 levels higher than a 33rd degree in another. It can be more like comparing ranks in two separate organizations that use different systems. The important question is not only the number, it is who issued it, what organization recognized it, what authority that body possessed, and what the degree actually represented inside that system. Once we ask those questions, the most sensational version of the mystery changes. The mystery is no longer, what terrible truth is hidden at degree 33? It becomes, why are we using degree 33 as proof of privileged knowledge before we have established the credential itself? That may sound less dramatic, but it is much harder to dismiss. Because the 2025 interview does not merely use 33 as decorative biography, the number shapes how the audience interprets everything that follows. If an ordinary former member says that the organization's public explanation is false, viewers can reasonably ask whether he misunderstood what he saw. If a former 33rd degree insider says the same thing, the claim appears to arrive from the top. The credential becomes part of the evidence. And when a credential becomes evidence, the credential itself must be examined. There is a second problem. Even if the 33rd degree claim were fully documented tomorrow, That would not automatically vary the extraordinary allegations attached to it. A credential can establish access. It cannot establish every conclusion drawn from that access. Suppose a certificate emerged showing beyond dispute that Schnoebelen received a recognized 33rd degree on a certain date. That would resolve one question. It would show that the interview's description was accurate in that specific sense. It would not prove that every Masonic body secretly teaches the interpretations he later gave to its rituals. It would not transform personal testimony into institutional documentation. For that, we would still need ritual texts, minutes, corroborating witnesses, archival records, or other evidence tied to the specific claim. This standard may feel demanding, but it is the same standard that makes genuinely strange evidence interesting. Freemasonry has enough documented history to sustain mystery without exaggeration. The fraternity really did build private systems of recognition. Members really did swear obligations. Lodges really did become influential social institutions. Some Masonic bodies developed elaborate high-degree systems. Political and religious opponents really did fear those networks. Governments really did suppress lodges in certain periods. Popes really did issue condemnations. Revolutionaries, monarchists, reformers, businessmen, artists, presidents, and ordinary tradesmen really did become Masons. The historical record is already dense. What it does not give us is a single hidden doctrine that can be cleanly traced from one lodge room through every branch of Masonry across the planet. This matters when we hear phrases like the royal secret. The name sounds as though the 32nd degree contains a factual revelation hidden from the lower degrees. In Scottish Rite tradition, however, degree names often function symbolically. The royal secret is embedded in moral and philosophical teaching. Public Scottish Rite material does not describe it as a literal disclosure that the fraternity serves a secret supernatural master. Critics may disagree with the theology or symbolism. Former members may interpret ceremonies differently, but a claim that the rite's public explanation is a deliberate cover requires evidence beyond the ominous sound of the title. This is why secret society investigations are so easy to get wrong. The institution gives us real secrecy. Critics give us real testimony. Old texts give us real strange language. History gives us real political networks. The internet then places all four on the same table and quietly removes the labels. A private password becomes proof of a hidden religion. A mystical writer becomes an official spokesman. A symbolic degree becomes a command rank. A personal interpretation becomes the meaning of the ritual. A disputed credential becomes the reason we should trust the interpretation. Once that process is complete, the theory appears much stronger than any individual piece of evidence actually is. There are 2 episodes in Masonic history that show why that standard matters, and they point in opposite directions. The first happened in New York in 1826. A man named William Morgan was preparing to publish an exposé of Masonic ritual. He was arrested, moved between jurisdictions, and ultimately disappeared after being taken from a jail. Several men were later convicted of kidnapping him. Morgan's body was never conclusively recovered, and the exact circumstances of his death were never established in court. But the disappearance produced a national political reaction because there was real evidence of organized efforts by local Masons to prevent his publication and remove him from public view. The Morgan affair matters because it prevents a comfortable simplification of Masonic history. It would be false to say that every fear of secret influence was invented by hysterical outsiders. In Western New York, a network of men bound by fraternity and secrecy became entangled in an actual abduction. Public anger helped create the anti-Masonic movement and eventually the anti-Masonic Party, one of the earliest significant third parties in the United States. The scandal was powerful precisely because the underlying mechanism was understandable. Men with private loyalties also occupied positions in public life. When an institution prizes secrecy, the public has a legitimate interest in knowing whether those private obligations interfere with law, government, or justice. But history then gives us the opposite warning. Late in the 19th century, a French writer using the name Léotaxile announced spectacular revelations about an even deeper Masonic world. He described a hidden organization called Palladism, supposedly operating inside or beyond ordinary Freemasonry and devoted to Luciferian practices. The story had everything a secret society audience could want: hidden elites, initiatory ranks, an invisible inner order, dramatic rituals, and a woman named Diana Vaughan, who was presented as a former high-ranking participant. Religious critics of Freemasonry embraced parts of the story because it seemed to confirm what they already suspected. Then, in 1897, Taxil publicly revealed that the entire Palladist structure and Diana Vaughan narrative had been a hoax. Scholars of modern Satanism now treat the Taxil affair as one of the clearest examples of fabricated secret society evidence gaining credibility because it attached itself to an institution that was genuinely private and already controversial. The deception worked not because Freemasonry had no secrets, but because it had enough real secrecy to make an invented, deeper layer feel plausible. Placed beside each other, Morgan and Taxil create almost a perfect methodological problem. Morgan warns us not to assume that secrecy is harmless simply because conspiracies are often exaggerated. Taxil warns us not to assume that an extraordinary accusation is true simply because secrecy makes it difficult to disprove. One case contains documented criminal conduct surrounding a real conflict over Masonic secrecy. The other contains a fabricated inner order that survived for years because audiences wanted the accusation to be true. If we use only Morgan, we become too suspicious. If we use only Taxil, we become too dismissive. The correct question in both cases is the same. What evidence connects the claim to the institution? That question also protects us from a very old trick in conspiracy storytelling. Once a public institution denies an alleged inner doctrine, the storyteller can say the denial came from the public layer. If members deny it, they are too low-ranking. If high-ranking members deny it, they are protecting the oath. If documents contradict it, the real documents must be elsewhere. A theory structured this way can survive any evidence because every contradiction is converted into proof of deeper secrecy. The only way out is to require something falsifiable: a specific jurisdiction, a specific ritual, a specific date, a specific document, a specific person who can be independently placed in the room, a claim precise enough that evidence could either support it or weaken it. The 32nd versus 33rd degree discrepancy is valuable because it gives us exactly that kind of question. It is not metaphysical, it is administrative. It does not require access to the meaning of a symbol or to someone's private spiritual experience. Either a particular body conferred a particular status, or the phrase is being used in some different sense that needs to be explained. That is the kind of mystery a document can actually solve. But there is an equally important warning for skeptics. Institutions naturally prefer descriptions of themselves that emphasize their stated ideals. A public FAQ is evidence of what an organization says it is. It is not an infallible description of every lodge, every member, every historical period, or every informal practice. An official denial can be true, misleading, incomplete, or simply irrelevant to a local event. The existence of conspiracy theories does not absolve institutions from scrutiny. So the correct method is not to choose between believe the ex-Mason and believe the Masons. It is to make both sides pass through the same filter. When the Scottish Rite says the 33rd is an honor and that Master Mason remains the central Masonic degree, we can compare that claim with its statutes, histories, degree structure, and the way jurisdictions actually operate. When a former member says the 33rd revealed a hidden doctrine, we can ask which jurisdiction, what ceremony, what year, what text, and what corroboration exists. Neither side receives automatic immunity because of identity. That is especially important with Schnoebelen because his public narrative spans far more than Masonry. Over the years, he has described involvement in numerous occult and religious systems, often presenting experiences in terms that are difficult or impossible for outsiders to independently verify. That does not entitle us to call every memory false. It does mean we should not build a documentary around the assumption that the most extraordinary version is true simply because the speaker says he was there. The ethical problem is simple. If we accuse a living organization or living people of horrific hidden practices, the burden of evidence rises sharply. We cannot solve uncertainty by increasing the accusation, and this is where the 32 versus 33 discrepancy becomes useful, rather than merely embarrassing. It gives us a test case for how evidence should work. We have one public representation, former 33rd degree Mason. We have another public representation from the man's own ministry, former 32nd degree Mason. Both cannot describe the same credential in the same system in the same way unless some additional event or distinction explains the difference. So what evidence would settle it? A certificate from a recognized Supreme Council would help. A membership record identifying the jurisdiction and date would help. A contemporary announcement of the conferral would help. A clear statement from Schnoebelen distinguishing his recognized Scottish Rite status from any honorary or irregular 33rd degree title would help. Even a precise explanation that the podcast used 33rd degree in reference to a separate body would at least tell us what claim we are evaluating. Without that, the strongest factual description is narrower. Schnoebelen has for decades publicly described himself and been described by his own materials as a former 32nd degree Mason. A highly viewed 2025 interview presented him as a former 33rd degree Mason. The missing bridge is documentation, and the irony is difficult to miss. The interview invites us to distrust the public surface of a secretive institution. It tells the audience that titles, rituals, and official explanations may conceal deeper layers. Yet the most basic title attached to the witness is itself a layer we cannot simply take on faith. That does not mean the story ends here. In fact, it opens a better question about why the 33rd degree became so powerful in the public imagination in the first place. Part of the answer is visual. 33 looks final. It is unusual enough to seem coded. Scottish Rite regalia gives it ceremonial weight. Famous politicians, businessmen, military figures, entertainers, and civic leaders have held Masonic honors, encouraging the impression that advancement maps onto worldly power. Anti-Masonic literature amplified that impression by treating the highest visible degree as the natural location for whatever doctrine the lower degrees supposedly concealed. But the logic contains a paradox. If the 33rd degree were truly the final secret level of an organization determined to hide its real purpose, why would the number itself be publicly advertised? Scottish Rite temples display it, official publications discuss it, members place the double-headed eagle on rings, caps, and documents. Supreme Councils openly call themselves Supreme Councils of the 33rd degree. The existence of the degree is not the secret. What remains private is the initiatory experience and the internal meaning members attach to it. That difference between a secret fact and a private experience may be one of the most overlooked parts of Freemasonry. A password is a secret fact. Once leaked, anyone can know it. A ritual can also be transcribed. But reading a ritual and undergoing it inside a community are not the same experience. The atmosphere, expectation, symbolism, relationships, repetition, and personal interpretation can produce meaning that does not survive on the printed page. Scholars of initiation often emphasize that secrecy can preserve the experiential power of a ceremony, even when the words are technically available elsewhere. That may be why Freemasonry can remain mysterious after centuries of exposure. The words are available. The interpretations are not unified. And in that environment, a former insider has unusual power. He can tell the audience not only what happened, but what it really meant. The moment he does that, however, he crosses from witness into interpreter. The distinction is subtle, but it may explain much of the enduring argument around Schnoebelen. He may accurately remember parts of ceremonies he attended. He may sincerely believe the spiritual interpretation he later gave them. Other Masons may sincerely believe he has radically misunderstood those same symbols. Historians may identify elements in both accounts that reflect broader currents of Western esotericism, fraternal ritual, biblical symbolism, and 19th century Romantic mythology. None of those positions by itself proves a hidden global doctrine. A documentary that respects the audience should preserve those levels rather than flatten them. So let us return to the strongest possible version of the case against the conventional explanation. Freemasonry really does stratify knowledge. A candidate does not receive every ritual at once. Degrees are progressive. Certain ceremonies are reserved for members who have advanced. Recognition systems distinguish insiders from outsiders. Some Masonic writers have used explicitly esoteric language. Some historical Masons were deeply involved in occult, mystical, or alternative religious movements. And because Masonic institutions are decentralized, no single public statement can describe every private conversation that ever occurred under a square and compasses. If someone says that deeper involvement changed his understanding of the fraternity, that is plausible in the ordinary sense. Advancement can change what a member sees. Now the counterpoint: none of that establishes that advancement culminates in the specific hidden theology described by sensational anti-Masonic testimony. The existence of a private degree is not proof of the content alleged within it. The existence of an occultist who is also a Mason is not proof that his occultism was the fraternity's doctrine. The existence of symbolic language is not proof that the symbol has only one meaning. And the fact that lower-level members do not know every ceremony cannot be used to invalidate every lower-level member, while automatically validating whichever high-level witness tells the darkest story. The theory needs a bridge, and that bridge is exactly what is missing from the credential question, too. This is the residual anomaly, a man whose own ministry continues to describe him as a former 32nd-degree Mason was introduced to millions as a former 33rd-Degree Mason. The difference is only one number. But the entire cultural mythology around the interview tells us that one number matters enormously. 33 is the reason viewers are asked to believe he reached the top. 33 is the reason his explanation appears to outrank the explanations of ordinary Masons. 33 is the symbol in the title. If it matters that much when it supports the story, it has to matter when we verify the story. There may be a simple answer. Perhaps a document exists and has simply not been placed where skeptical researchers have found it. Perhaps the 33rd degree came from a body whose status he distinguishes from his Scottish Rite background. Perhaps the 2025 production team compressed a complicated resume into the most recognizable label. Any of those possibilities would reduce the mystery. But until the chain is clear, the responsible conclusion is not that Schnoebelen lied, and it is not that Freemasonry is innocent of every criticism. The responsible conclusion is that the central credential remains inadequately explained in the public material available to us, and that conclusion has a wider consequence. For more than 3 centuries, Freemasonry has occupied a strange position in Western culture. It is visible enough to have temples, charities, websites, museums, books, officers, and public ceremonies. It is private enough to preserve initiation and recognition systems. It has famous members, but no single worldwide leadership. It contains biblical language, but insists it is not a religion. It includes esoteric interpretations, but rejects the idea that one occult doctrine defines all Masonry. It has genuine history mixed with traditional history, and it produces former members who sometimes describe the same experience in completely incompatible ways. That combination guarantees mystery, but mystery is not the same thing as permission to believe every explanation. The most useful question is always the one that survives after both believers and skeptics have had their strongest turn. The conventional explanation says Freemasonry is a fraternal initiatory system whose symbols and private rituals have been repeatedly transformed by outsiders into evidence of a secret religion or political command structure. That explanation accounts for a great deal. It explains why degree numbers are misunderstood. It explains why mystical language from individual authors gets mistaken for official doctrine. It explains why secrecy magnifies rumor. It explains why different Masonic jurisdictions can contradict the idea of one hidden global hierarchy. The darker interpretation says secrecy and compartmentalization make public descriptions inherently incomplete. Members can only describe what they personally received. Advanced bodies can preserve material lower members have never encountered. Public relations cannot automatically be treated as a complete map of internal life. That is also reasonable up to a point. What the darker interpretation still has to prove is the final step, that the concealed layer contains the specific extraordinary doctrine being alleged, and that the witness claiming privileged access actually possessed the credential used to establish that access. That is where the evidence thins. And perhaps that is the most revealing thing about this entire story. We began with a promise that a 33rd degree insider could finally explain what ordinary people were not allowed to know. But after examining the structure of Freemasonry, the history of its degrees, the role of private ritual, the misuse of famous quotations, and the witness's own published biography, the hidden question turns out to be much simpler. Before we ask what he learned at the 33rd degree, we still need to establish which 33rd degree he actually received. If you enjoy investigations where the mystery survives only after the strongest explanation has been tested, you can subscribe to Mr. Occultus. Here, the goal is not to tell you what to believe. It is to find the point where the documents stop answering. And in this case, I am curious where you draw that line. Does the repeated 32nd degree description look like an ordinary biographical inconsistency that could be cleared up with one record? Or does it change how much weight you give the 2025 testimony in the first place? Because after all the symbols, oaths, degrees, and stories about what might exist behind closed doors, the part that still does not add up is not hidden in a lodge room. It is printed in the biography of the man who says he went inside.